There's a particular look people get when they're trying to hide something, a mix of casualness and a guilty flutter in the eyes that betrays them. I never thought I'd see that look on Maria's face, not in 12 years of marriage. It happened on a Friday evening, over at our friend Greg's house. Greg hosts this poker night once a month. It's casual, just the guys, and we rotate who brings the beer. Maria always teased me about it, calling it my midlife crisis rehearsal. This time, Maria decided to come along. She said she wanted to catch up with Greg's wife, Amanda. That was unusual. Poker night was sacredly dull for the wives, a time for them to enjoy a peaceful evening at home. But Maria was insistent, even throwing on a dress instead of her usual leggings and hoodie. Things got weirder when I noticed how much attention she was giving Greg. It wasn't blatant, not enough to cause a scene, but enough to make me notice. The laughs at his jokes were just a little too loud, her touches on his arm just a little too lingering. I wasn't the only one who saw it. As the hands rolled on and the chips stacked up, I caught Greg's wife watching them too. Amanda wasn't smiling. The moment that really stuck out was when Maria excused herself to get something from the car. She was gone longer than she should have been. Greg left a few minutes later to check the grill. My stomach knotted. I told myself I was imagining things. I didn't want to be that guy, paranoid and suspicious over nothing. But when Greg returned alone, smiling in that smug, knowing way, and Maria came back a little too breezy, my blood started boiling. I didn't say anything at the time. I'm not one to jump to conclusions. But as we drove home that night, the silence between us felt heavier than usual. "Did you have fun?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She smiled, staring out the window. "Yeah, it was nice to see Amanda." Her answer was too quick. Something wasn't adding up. The following morning started like any other Saturday. Maria was up before me, making coffee and scrolling on her tablet at the dining table. Her hair was tied up in a lazy bun, and she wore the faded t-shirt I'd bought her years ago from a concert we went to together. It struck me how normal she looked, like nothing had changed. But something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling from poker night. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was instinct. Every fiber of me felt off, as if my life had shifted ever so slightly, and I was the only one who noticed. I spent most of the morning in a quiet daze. Our kids were out at a sleepover, which gave us the rare chance to enjoy a slow morning together. But for the first time, I felt like I didn't know how to act around her. "Want pancakes?" she asked, standing by the stove, spatula in hand. "Sure," I replied. I kept my tone even and casual, like I wasn't replaying every moment from the night before in my head. "Blueberries or plain?" "Plain's fine." Maria hummed as she cooked, moving about the kitchen like this was any other day. But it wasn't. Around noon, she said she needed to run some errands. This wasn't unusual, Maria was always the one to take care of the household shopping, but today, it felt too convenient. "Want me to come along?" I asked. She blinked at me, just for a moment, before smiling. "Nah, I'll be quick. Besides, I know you hate wandering around the store." She kissed my cheek and left before I could say anything else. As soon as the door shut behind her, I felt my stomach churn. I had never been the kind of husband to snoop. I trusted Maria, at least, I thought I had. But something about her behavior was gnawing at me, and I couldn't let it go. I needed to know if I was overthinking this or if there was something real behind my unease. I didn't start by rifling through her things, that would have been too obvious and too invasive. Instead, I went out to the car. I figured if something was going on, maybe I'd find something there, nothing too blatant, just something small that would confirm or deny my suspicions. The car was spotless, as usual. Maria kept things tidy to the point of obsession, so I didn't expect to find much. But as I moved the passenger seat forward, I noticed a receipt tucked under the floor mat. It was from a local bar. That wouldn't have been odd, except for the timestamp. It was from a weeknight at 10:45 p.m., a night Maria had said she was at a late meeting with her team. I stared at the receipt, my mind racing. Maria wasn't much of a drinker, and she wasn't the kind of person who'd hang out at a bar alone. So who was she with? Before I could think too much about it, I heard the garage door open. I shoved the receipt into my pocket and stepped away from the car, pretending to adjust something in the trunk. Maria walked in, carrying a couple of grocery bags. "You're out here?" she asked, surprised. "Just tidying up a bit," I said, keeping my voice casual. She gave me a curious look but didn't press further. That night, I couldn't sleep. The receipt had opened a door I didn't know how to close. My heart told me there had to be an explanation, something innocent the first was overlooking, but my head was starting to paint a very different picture. I decided to dig deeper. Maria had left her laptop open in the living room, so while she showered, I sat down at the table and opened it. Her email was already logged in, and I told myself I'd only check one thing, her calendar. If she really had a meeting that night, it would be there. But there was no meeting. Instead, there was a blank slot from 9 to 11 p.m., no location, no notes. Just empty time. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. My pulse was hammering in my chest, and my hands felt clammy. The receipt wasn't an isolated thing. There was more to this. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, waiting for her to come downstairs. The next day, I decided to take a more direct approach. I wasn't ready to confront Maria yet. I needed something undeniable, something that would remove any chance of doubt. I called Greg. Greg and I weren't particularly close, but we'd known each other for years. He was the kind of guy who could smooth over any tension with a joke, and people tended to underestimate him because of it. But I knew Greg had a sharp mind and a sharper eye. "Hey, man," I said when he picked up. "Got a second?" "Sure, what's up?" I hesitated, unsure how to frame my question. "About the other night at poker. Did you notice anything weird?" Greg laughed. "Weird? Like what? You getting cleaned out in the first hour?" I forced a chuckle. "No, I mean, with Maria and Amanda. Or, I don't know, just in general." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Dan," Greg said, his voice lower now, "what are you asking me?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Just, if you saw anything." Greg sighed. "Look, man, I don't know what's going on, but Amanda mentioned something. She said Maria seemed off." "Off how?" "Like she was paying more attention to me than she was to you," Greg said carefully. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now. I clenched my jaw, the knot in my stomach tightening. Later that week, I decided to take a day off work without telling Maria. I wanted to see where she went during the day, how she spent her time. I followed her car from a distance, careful not to get too close. She drove across town to a small cafe I didn't recognize. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she got out of the car. A few minutes later, a man joined her at a table near the window. My chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. He was laughing at something she said, and she was leaning forward, her hand brushing against his arm. This wasn't a business meeting. This wasn't innocent. I stayed in the car, my mind racing. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner, for letting myself believe that our life together was untouchable. Maria had been hiding something from me, and now I had the proof. It was time to confront her. That night, I waited for her to come home. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of the clock, felt louder than it should have. I sat at the dining table, the receipt and my thoughts laid out in front of me. It wasn't enough to just ask her outright. I needed answers, the full story. She walked in around 7 p.m., looking just as calm and collected as ever. A bag of takeout hung from one hand, and she smiled at me like it was any other day. "Dinner," she announced, setting the bag on the counter. "I didn't feel like cooking tonight." "Good," I said, standing. My voice was sharper than I intended, and she turned to look at me, her smile faltering slightly. "What's wrong?" I held up the receipt. It dangled between my fingers like a verdict. "What's this?" Her brows furrowed, and she stepped closer to look. "What do you mean?" "It's a receipt." "Yeah, from a bar. From a weeknight." I kept my tone even, though my chest felt like it was about to explode. The same night you told me you had a late meeting. Her eyes widened just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough for me to catch it. You were digging through my things? She asked, defensive now. I was looking for the truth, I shot back. Because you sure as hell haven't been giving it to me. Maria stared at me for a long moment. I saw the wheels turning in her head, the calculations, the effort to come up with something to say. It's not what you think, she said finally, her voice measured. Then explain it to me, I said. I kept my tone controlled, though it felt like my blood was boiling under my skin. She sighed and looked away, folding her arms across her chest. I was out with Greg. The name hit me like a slap. Greg? As in Greg from poker night? Yes. And you didn't think to tell me? I didn't think it was a big deal, she snapped. He said he needed to talk about Amanda, and it was private. I was trying to be a friend. I laughed bitterly. You expect me to believe that? It's the truth, she said, her tone growing sharper. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Am I? I demanded, stepping closer. Because it didn't look like you were just being a friend when I saw you with him at the cafe today. Her face went pale. You followed me? Damn right I did, I said. I had to, because you've been lying to me. Do you even hear yourself? Late night bar meetups, secret lunches, this isn't how you treat your husband, Maria. This isn't how you treat your family. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like she was struggling to find the right words. You don't understand, she said finally. Then make me understand, I shot back. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't supposed to go this far. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. I stared at her, waiting for her to elaborate. Maria's voice cracked as she spoke. We started talking a while ago, just texting. It was nothing serious. But then it escalated. Escalated how? I demanded. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. We kissed. Once. My fists clenched at my sides. Once? That's it? Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't believe her. Not for a second. And you expect me to trust you now? I made a mistake, Daniel, she said, her tone pleading. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I let things get out of hand. But it didn't mean anything. You expect me to believe that too? I said, my voice rising. You're telling me you threw away 12 years of marriage for something that didn't mean anything? Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't throw anything away. I love you, I love our family. I messed up, but I didn't want to lose everything. I shook my head, the anger bubbling up in me like a volcano ready to erupt. You didn't want to lose everything, but you risked it anyway. You betrayed me, Maria. Do you even understand what you've done? I do, she cried. I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to fix it. I want to fix it. How? How do you fix something like this? I demanded. Because from where I'm standing, the damage is already done. She stepped closer, reaching for me, but I pulled back. Don't, I said, my voice cold. You don't get to play the victim here. Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, sobbing. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the cafe, the bar, the way she laughed with him like I didn't exist. You didn't just hurt me, I said. You hurt our family. You hurt everything we've built together. I'll do anything, she said through her tears. Anything to make this right. But I didn't know if there was any way to make it right. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there to cry. I needed space, needed air, needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I didn't go to bed that night. I stayed in the garage, sitting on the old couch that had seen better days. My mind was a whirlwind of anger and betrayal. Maria's confession wasn't enough for me. It was hollow, carefully crafted to make the affair seem like a minor slip-up. I knew better. I had seen her demeanor, her comfort with Greg. A single kiss didn't explain that kind of intimacy. I needed the truth, the full, unvarnished truth. And if Maria wasn't going to give it to me willingly, I'd find it myself. By morning, I had a plan. I drove to the hardware store and bought a small audio recording device. It was tiny, no bigger than a matchbox, and easy to conceal. When I got home, Maria was in the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Hey," she said softly, like she wasn't sure if I was still angry. I didn't say much, just grunted and went about my business. I wasn't ready to confront her again, not yet. That afternoon, when she went to the store, I planted the recorder under the passenger seat of her car. If she and Greg were still meeting, I'd catch them. The next few days were a blur. Maria acted like everything was normal, trying to engage me in conversations, cooking my favorite meals, even attempting to initiate intimacy one night. I played along just enough to avoid suspicion but kept my distance. Then, finally, the recorder paid off. It was a Thursday. Maria left the house around noon, saying she was meeting a friend for coffee. I waited until she got back, then retrieved the device from her car. My hands were shaking as I connected it to my laptop and played the recording. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the car starting and music playing. Then came the voice I dreaded hearing. "Greg. Did he suspect anything?" Greg's voice was calm, almost amused. "No," Maria replied. "I told him it was just a kiss." My stomach tightened as I listened. "Do you think he bought it?" Greg asked. "I don't know," Maria said. "He's been so distant. I don't know what to do." "Well, as long as he doesn't find out about everything else, you should be fine," Greg said with a chuckle. Everything else. I clenched my fists, anger boiling over as their conversation continued. They talked about meeting again, about keeping things discreet, about how much they enjoyed being together. The bastard had laughed. Maria had confessed, and he'd laughed. I didn't wait for the recording to finish. I slammed the laptop shut and paced the garage, the walls feeling like they were closing in on me. It wasn't just the affair that enraged me, it was the audacity. They thought they could carry on like this, like I was some oblivious fool who couldn't put the pieces together. They had underestimated me. That weekend, I put the second part of my plan into action. I called Amanda, Greg's wife. We had never been particularly close, but I knew her well enough to know she deserved to know the truth. "Amanda," I said when she picked up. "It's Daniel." "Hey," she said, sounding surprised. "What's up?" "I need to talk to you," I said. "It's about Greg. And Maria." There was a long pause. "What about them? Can we meet?" I asked. "This isn't something I want to say over the phone." She agreed, and we met at a quiet cafe later that afternoon. When I told her everything about the bar receipt, the cafe, the recording, her face went pale. At first, she seemed to be in denial, shaking her head as if trying to dismiss it all as a misunderstanding. But when I played the recording for her, the truth hit her like a freight train. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling. I knew something was off, but I didn't think. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt for being the one to shatter her world. But then I remembered that Greg and Maria were the ones who had done this, not me. "What do we do?" she asked finally. "We expose them," I said. The next day, Amanda and I put our plan into motion. We agreed to confront them together, to catch them off guard and make sure they couldn't weasel their way out of the truth. We chose Greg's house as the location. Amanda invited Maria over under the guise of needing advice about some renovations, and I texted Greg, pretending to be Maria, saying she wanted to talk. When the day came, my heart was pounding as I arrived at Greg's house. Amanda was already there, looking tense but determined. "They're inside," she said. We stepped into the living room together, where Maria and Greg sat on opposite ends of the couch. They both looked up in surprise when they saw us. "What's going on?" Maria asked, her voice shaky. You tell me, I said, pulling out my phone. I played the recording, the damning conversation filling the room. Maria's face turned white. Greg's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he realized the jig was up. You spied on me? Maria asked, her voice rising in anger. I did what I had to do, I said. And now, I want the truth. All of it. For the next hour, the room was a war zone of accusations, denials, and confessions. Maria admitted that the affair had been going on for months, far longer than she'd initially claimed. Greg tried to downplay it, saying it wasn't serious, but Amanda wasn't having it. You betrayed me, she said, tears streaming down her face. Both of you. By the time it was over, the damage was irreparable. I told Maria I wanted her out of the house by the end of the week. Amanda said the same to Greg. As I left, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They thought they could play me, but in the end, I was the one who had outsmarted them. They wanted to keep their secret, but now the whole world would know. Maria spent the next few days in a state of quiet desperation. She didn't argue about leaving, but every moment in the house was heavy with unspoken words and stifled sobs. She made a few attempts to talk to me, but I wasn't ready. I told her I'd listen when I felt like I could without exploding in anger. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and backed off. On the morning of her last day in the house, she cornered me in the kitchen. I was fixing a coffee, staring at the machine like it held all the answers. She stepped in cautiously, like approaching a wild animal. Dan, she began, her voice soft. Can we talk? Please? I nodded stiffly, motioning to the dining table. She sat down, folding her hands tightly, and I joined her. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she broke the silence. I know I destroyed us, she said, her voice trembling. And I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness. But I need you to understand. I never stopped loving you. I scoffed, shaking my head. You have a funny way of showing love, Maria. I was stupid, she continued, her words coming in a rush. I got caught up in something I didn't fully understand. Greg, he made me feel special, like I was someone exciting and new. But it was a fantasy, Dan. It wasn't real. And what about us? I asked. Was that real? Of course it was, she said, her voice breaking. It still is. You're my husband, the father of my children. I don't know why I let myself get so lost. But I swear to you, I never meant for this to happen. You didn't mean for it to happen, I repeated, my tone cold. But you let it happen. Over and over again. And now you expect me to just, what? Move past it? No, she said quickly. I know I've ruined everything. I just want you to know the truth. I never wanted to lose you, Dan. I stared at her, my anger simmering just below the surface. You didn't just lose me, Maria. You threw me away. You threw us away. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. Not after everything. I want you to answer something for me, I said finally, my voice low. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Was it worth it? I asked. She blinked, confused. All of it, the sneaking around, the lies, the betrayal. Was it worth it? Did Greg make you feel so special that it was worth destroying our family? Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. No, she whispered. It wasn't worth it. None of it was worth it. Good, I said, standing up. At least we agree on that. The kids came home later that day. Maria had begged me not to tell them the full truth, and as much as I hated her for what she'd done, I didn't want to hurt them unnecessarily. We told them together that we were separating, that we loved them both deeply, and that nothing about this was their fault. Emma cried, clinging to Maria like she couldn't bear to let go. Josh, our eldest, sat silently, his jaw tight, his face a mask of barely contained anger. Why? He asked finally, his voice shaking. It's complicated, Maria said softly, reaching for him. But he pulled away, his eyes blazing. You promised us, he said. You promised we'd always be a family. We'll still be a family, I said, stepping in. Just, in a different way. He didn't look convinced, and honestly, neither was I. That night, Maria packed her things and loaded them into her car. I stayed inside, watching through the window as she moved back and forth, her movements slow and reluctant. When she was done, she came to the door, her eyes searching mine. This is goodbye, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. Dan, she said, her voice breaking. If there's ever a chance, any chance at all, please don't shut me out completely. I didn't respond. Instead, I stepped back and closed the door. The days that followed were a blur. I filed for divorce, finalized the custody arrangements, and started therapy to deal with the storm of emotions raging inside me. Anger, sadness, betrayal, they all came in waves, crashing over me without warning. Maria reached out a few times, sending long, apologetic emails and texts. I read them but never responded. There was nothing left to say. One day, about 2 weeks after she left, I sat down with the kids for a heart-to-heart. They deserved to know the truth, even if it was hard to hear. I need to tell you something, I began, my voice steady but firm. Emma looked up at me, her eyes wide and anxious. Josh stared at the floor, his jaw tight. What happened between your mom and me? It wasn't just a case of us growing apart, I said. There was betrayal. She made choices that hurt our family. Emma burst into tears, and Josh's fists clenched at his sides. I reached out, pulling them both into a hug. It's okay to be angry, I said. It's okay to be sad. I feel those things too. But we're going to get through this. Together. Maria tried to call that night, but I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail, her voice thick with emotion. I know I don't deserve anything from you, she said. But I hope someday you can forgive me. For everything. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. The weeks that followed Maria's departure were chaotic but strangely clarifying. The silence in the house was deafening at first, especially during the times when the kids were at school or with their friends. I'd sit in the living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I thought I understood, family photos, souvenirs from vacations, the mug Maria had given me on our first anniversary. Each item felt like it belonged to a stranger. But as the days turned into weeks, the fog started to lift. I realized that my life wasn't over. Broken, yes. But not over. My first real step forward came when I boxed up Maria's things. I didn't rush through it or let anger dictate my actions. It was deliberate, methodical. I needed to reclaim the space, not just physically but emotionally. The wedding photo came off the wall, replaced by a picture of the kids. Her favorite blanket went into the box, and I threw away the scented candles she loved, which still lingered faintly in the air. By the end of the day, the house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like mine. The divorce process was straightforward. Maria didn't contest anything. She signed the papers without a fight, almost as though she were trying to atone for her betrayal by making the split as painless as possible. But there was no making it painless. The hardest part was sitting in the lawyer's office, signing my name on a stack of documents that officially ended what I thought was forever. When the last page was done, the lawyer looked at me with a practiced sympathy I didn't want. It's a clean break, she said, as if that was supposed to comfort me. I nodded, stood, and left without saying another word. The kids struggled. Emma cried almost every night, asking if there was any way to fix things. Why can't we just go back to the way it was, she'd ask, her voice trembling. Josh's anger was quieter but just as potent. He stopped talking to Maria entirely, refusing to answer her calls or texts. I tried to encourage him to at least hear her out, but he was stubborn. She made her choice, he said flatly. She doesn't get to play the victim now. I couldn't argue with that, but it hurt to see him carry so much anger. I didn't want him to grow up thinking relationships were doomed to fail, that betrayal was inevitable. So I focused on being there for them, even when I felt like I was barely holding myself together. I took time off work, picked them up from school, and planned little outings: bowling, a trip to the zoo, movie nights at home. They needed stability, and I needed to show them that we could still be a family, even if it looked different now. Maria wasn't content to fade into the background. She tried to stay involved with the kids, picking them up for her scheduled weekends and attending their school events. But things were strained. One Saturday, when she came to pick them up, she asked if we could talk. I agreed, mostly because I was curious about what she thought she could possibly say. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know you probably don't want to hear this," she began, "but I'm sorry, Dan. For everything. I know I hurt you and the kids in ways I can't undo." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "So why did you do it?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think I was looking for something I thought I'd lost. But I see now that it wasn't Greg or anyone else. It was me. I wasn't happy with myself, and I made you and the kids pay for it. Do you think that makes it better?" I asked, my voice calm but icy. "No," she said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that it wasn't your fault. You were a good husband, Dan. Better than I deserved." For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. We sat at the dining table, the same place where we'd had so many conversations over the years about work, the kids, vacations, and now, the wreckage of our marriage. "I'm trying to move on," I said finally. "But it's hard when I keep asking myself what I could have done differently." Maria shook her head, her voice firm. "Don't do that to yourself. This wasn't about you, Dan. It was my mistake. My failure." I nodded, taking in her words. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave me a sliver of clarity. When she left with the kids that day, I felt lighter. Not because things were fixed, they never would be, but because I realized I didn't need her validation anymore. I didn't need her to explain or justify or beg for forgiveness. The turning point came a month later, during one of Josh's soccer games. Maria was there, sitting on the opposite side of the bleachers. We didn't speak, but I caught her watching me once or twice. After the game, she approached me in the parking lot. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said simply. She nodded, her face softening. "I'm glad." We stood there for a moment, the tension between us finally ebbing away. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said. "You too," she replied. It wasn't closure, not completely. But it was enough. Life moved on. The house felt emptier without her, but it also felt calmer. The kids adjusted, slowly but surely. I focused on rebuilding my relationship with them, my sense of self, and eventually, my willingness to trust again. One night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through old photos, I came across one of the four of us on a camping trip. We were smiling, happy, oblivious to what was coming. I didn't delete it. I didn't throw it away. It was a reminder of what had been and what I was determined to build again, even if it looked different this time.